The CIA, of course, has for decades perfected these techniques for mind control. And, and this isn't paranoia, by the way. Their program was called MK Ultra, the original one. MK Naomi, MK Dietrich, and the other ones. And MK stands for mind control. That was the code for, mind control. And they were devising ways to control not only individuals and, get people to become unwitting assassins, what they call Manchurian candidates, etc. And all this is well documented because the Church Committee and, and the Rockefeller Commission and many, many other, what I'm saying now is not, the ravings of a paranoid anti-vaxxer. It's this is what, I don't think these are even controversial concepts because they're so well documented. But also they were devising ways to control whole populations. How do you impose control, a centralized control on an indigenous population, a foreign country, by, first of all, disabling institutions, by using propaganda to sow fear, by polarization, deliberate polarization of the population, by sowing the country with chaos agents, and, all these techniques for creating chaos in developing countries so that you can come in the CIA. The CIA was involved in coups d'etats or attempted coups d'etats between 1947 and 1997 against a third of the nations on Earth, and most of them were democracies. And so the CIA does not do public health. It does coups d'etats. That's what they specialize in. And they had, during that period of MK Ultra, they were paying social scientists to devise ways of social control. And some of those were individual. They were using psychedelic drugs like LSD. They were using sensory deprivation, torture techniques, and then, fear and propaganda and authoritarian messages, etc., and experimenting with all these things to figure out what worked. Well, in beginning around 2016, with the election of Trump and with Brexit, it seems like at that point the intelligence agencies made a decision to turn all of those weapons onto the American people. And by the way, in my book, in the Fauci book, I talk about this event called Event 201, which was a pandemic simulation that took place in October 2019 in New York. And it was sponsored by Bill Gates, I think the World Economic Forum, by the Chinese CDC. George Gao was there. Mm-hmm. The social media companies were there. The pharmaceutical companies were there. The big corporate PR firms were there. And they were...
The current DNI was there.
Yeah, the current DNI, Avril Haines, who's the director of national intelligence, who's the top spy now in the world. And at that time, she was the former deputy director of the CIA. And Avril Haines made her bones at the CIA by covering up the Abu Ghraib and the Guantanamo Bay torture tapes, and covering up the illegal destruction of those tapes, and then covering up the illegal tapping of the United States Senate by the people who had destroyed those tapes or who were trying to protect the people who destroyed those tapes. So she's like a impresario at cover-ups. She's President Biden's top spy. She was the former deputy director of the CIA, and she is at this simulation. What is the CIA doing in a pandemic simulation? They're not a public health agency. As I said, they're an agency that does coups d'etats. And if you look at what they did, that agency is simulating a global coronavirus pandemic that kills 60 million people, which is a lot more than the actual one did, which was 2 months later, which we learned about 2 months later. Although it was already circulating in October of 2019, we didn't know about it until January 2020. So what are they talking about? They're not talking about public health. They're not talking about how do we get vitamin D to everybody to build their immune systems? How do we keep them outside and healthy? How do we get people to lose weight? How do we quarantine the sick and yet, protect constitutional rights and protect the vulnerable and all of those kind of things that you would normally talk about? No. What they're talking about is using this pandemic as a pretext for clamping down totalitarian controls. And the first thing they said is we gotta limit free speech. We can't allow people to criticize government policies. And particularly, we cannot allow people to talk about a lab leak. They're doing this in October of 2019, before anybody of us have ever heard of Wuhan. So, and if you look at it, during that part of the discussion, which is the fourth part, Avril Haines is kind of leading it.
How can governments, international businesses, international organizations ensure that reliable information is getting to the public and prevent highly damaging and false information to the extent that's possible about the pandemic from spreading and causing deepening crisis around the world?
Every time there is something that comes out that is in fact false information that is starting to actually hamper our ability to address the pandemic, then we need to be able to respond quickly to it. One of the things we want to do is work with telecommunication companies to actually ensure that everybody has access to the kind of communications that we're interested in providing, because that's going to be critical for dealing with, obviously, the explosion of the disease.
There's misinformation, and there's some belief. People believe, this is a man-made, some pharmaceutical company made the virus. So we really need to train the health workers, especially health care workers, their access to the patients, to the public. So make sure they got the right information.
And so I think we really need to make sure, one, from a news perspective, that information is being disseminated correctly, and that we have the right resources out there to provide this information.
It's not just about handing people a piece of knowledge. It's also about how we incentivize them to manage their behaviours, which in any communicable disease outbreak, behaviour of one sort will minimise your chance of getting a disease versus behaviour of another sort, which may maximise that chance.
This is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.
That was not a one-off pandemic simulation. The CIA has been conducting these simulations since 2001, 5 months before the anthrax attacks, and predicted everything that would happen. And each one of these simulations, there are high-level CIA personnel taking place and running them, like James Woolsey, the deputy director, and Ruth David and Tara O'Toole, and other people from In-Q-Tel and the CIA. And again, they're practicing how do we use the next pandemic to execute a coup d'etat against American democracy and against the Bill of Rights. How do we dismantle the Bill of Rights? And that is very, very worrying, because everything that they've modeled, they did.